The thunder cracked across the Montana sky as Ruby Morley clutched her 6-year-old daughter's hand tighter, pulling the worn shawl over both their heads as they hurried down the muddy main street of Timber Creek. The year was 1879, and life for a widow with a child and no family connections in these untamed territories was as harsh as the winter that had just passed. "Mama, they're looking again," little Abigail whispered, her chin tucked against her chest as they passed the general store where several children stood under the awning, pointing and whispering. "Don't mind them, Abby," Ruby murmured, though the words stung like the raindrops pelting her face. 3 months in this frontier town, and still they were outsiders, the woman with no husband, no brothers, no father to speak for her, and the little girl who bore the brunt of that isolation on the schoolyard daily. From the shadow of the livery stable, a tall figure watched their progress through the rain. Zachariah Powell adjusted his hat lower over his eyes, his hand absently stroking the neck of the chestnut mare beside him. Something about the determined set of the woman's shoulders as she shepherded her child through town, ignoring the stares and whispers, stirred something inside him that he'd thought long buried in the dust of the trail. Ruby kept her eyes fixed on the small cabin at the edge of town where she had established her dressmaking business after arriving in Timber Creek. The rent was steep for what little she earned, but it was a roof, and she'd known worse. Before she could reach the relative safety of her porch, a clump of mud sailed through the air, landing with a wet splat at Abigail's feet. "No kin, Abby. No kin, Abby," came the cruel chant from a group of boys who had trailed them at a distance. "Where's your pa, no kin? Where's your grandpa? Your uncles? You ain't got nobody." Abigail's small body stiffened beside Ruby, but she didn't cry. She'd stopped crying at the taunts weeks ago, and that broke Ruby's heart more than the tears ever had. Before Ruby could turn to confront the boys, the thunder of hooves splashed through the mud-slicked street. The chestnut mare reared slightly as the rider pulled her up sharply beside the children, who scattered like frightened rabbits. "That's enough of that," came a deep voice that carried authority without raising its volume. The cowboy sat tall in his saddle, rainwater streaming from the brim of his hat. "Unless you boys are volunteering to explain yourselves to Sheriff Miller." The threat was enough to send the last of the children scurrying away. The rider turned his attention to Ruby and Abigail, and for the first time, Ruby got a clear look at his face beneath the hat brim. Square-jawed and weathered, with eyes the color of a summer storm and a day's growth of beard shadowing his cheeks. She recognized him as one of the hands from the Powell ranch outside of town, the big spread that supplied most of the beef to the mining camps in the territory. "Madam," he said, tipping his hat. "Zachariah Powell, those boys giving you trouble?" Ruby lifted her chin, pride overriding her gratitude. "Nothing we can't handle, Mr. Powell, but I thank you for your intervention." His eyes moved to Abigail, who was staring up at him with undisguised fascination, particularly at the gleaming silver spurs on his boots and the well-worn leather chaps protecting his legs. "And who might this young lady be?" he asked, his voice gentling as he addressed the child. "I'm Abigail Morley, sir," she answered with unexpected boldness. "I'm 6 3/4. A smile crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Well, Miss Abigail Morley, 6 3/4 is mighty grown up." He shifted in his saddle, then made a decision. He extended his hand down toward her. "Would you like to see what the world looks like from up here?" Abigail's eyes widened, and she looked to her mother for permission. Ruby hesitated. They were already the subject of enough gossip without her daughter being seen perched in front of the handsome ranch hand. But the joy in Abigail's face at the prospect was something Ruby hadn't seen in too long. "Just around the street and back," Zachariah assured her, reading her hesitation. so the young miss can hold her head high when those boys come back around. Something in his understanding gaze melted Ruby's resistance. She nodded once, and Zachariah leaned down, scooping Abigail up with one strong arm and settling her securely in front of him on the saddle. "Hold onto the horn just like that," he instructed, and Abigail gripped the saddle horn with both hands, her back straight and her face transformed with delight. Zachariah turned the mare in a tight circle, then walked her at a sedate pace down the main street, past the general store where several townspeople had paused to watch the spectacle. Ruby followed alongside, her heart in her throat, but Zachariah's arm was secure around Abigail's waist, and her daughter's laughter, when had she last heard that sound, floated back to her on the rain-washed air. As they made their way down the street, Ruby noticed something changing. The same people who normally averted their eyes now nodded respectfully. The Powell name carried weight in Timber Creek, and Zachariah's public display was not lost on anyone watching. When they returned to Ruby's cabin, Zachariah swung down from the saddle with fluid grace, then lifted Abigail down as if she weighed nothing more than a feather pillow. "Thank you, Mr. Powell," Abigail said with a curtsy that Ruby had taught her, though her eyes still shone with excitement. "Zach," he corrected with a wink. "My friends call me Zach." "Thank you, Zach," Abigail amended, the name strange but wonderful on her tongue. Ruby stepped forward, extending her hand. "We're both grateful, Mr. Powell. Not many would have bothered." He took her hand, and Ruby tried to ignore the warmth that spread from his calloused palm to hers. "Just doing what needed doing, Mrs. Morley, and it's Zach to you as well, if you don't mind." "Ruby," she returned, withdrawing her hand perhaps a moment too late. "Though I'm not sure the town would approve of such familiarity." A shadow crossed his face. "The town's got plenty of opinions, most not worth the breath used to speak them." He glanced at Abigail, who was stroking the mare's velvet nose with reverent fingers. "She's a fine girl. Deserves better than what those young ruffians were dishing out." "Yes, well, children can be cruel, especially to those who are different." Zachariah's eyes, surprisingly perceptive for a man who spent most of his days with cattle, studied her face. "You're the seamstress, aren't you?" "Came in from back east somewhere. St. Louis," Ruby confirmed, "though that hardly qualifies as back east to most here." "Far enough," he said with a nod. "Heard you do fine work." Ruby wondered what else he had heard. About her husband's death from typhoid 2 years past. About how she'd struggled to keep their small boarding house until the debts became too much. About how she'd gathered what little remained and brought Abigail west, hoping for a fresh start where no one knew their history. "I manage," she said simply. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and Zachariah glanced at the darkening sky. "Best be getting back to the ranch. Got a herd coming in tomorrow, and the boss doesn't take kindly to stragglers." He hesitated, then added, "My sister's getting married next month. Might be she'll need some fine stitching for her dress. Would it be all right if I sent her your way?" Ruby recognized the gesture for what it was, not charity exactly, but a hand extended in friendship, a way to lend her some of the Powell names standing in the community. "I'd be happy to help," she said, and meant it. With a nod and another tip of his hat, Zachariah mounted his horse. "Miss Abigail," he said, looking down at the child who still stood in awe of him, "you hold your head up now. You hear? A girl like you has plenty to be proud of." He clicked to his horse and rode away, the hoofbeats fading into the gathering dusk. Ruby stood with her arm around Abigail's shoulders, watching until he disappeared around the bend. "Mama," Abigail said in a voice filled with wonder, "did you see? Everyone was looking at me sitting up there with him. Not mean looks, different looks." "I saw," Ruby said softly, and she had. She'd seen how quickly perceptions could shift with just one man's kindness. She'd seen the respect in the nods directed their way. And she'd seen something else, something in Zachariah Powell's storm-gray eyes that she wasn't sure she was ready to acknowledge. "Come inside now," she said, guiding Abigail toward their door. "We've got beans to warm for supper, and you need to get out of those damp clothes." But that night, as Abigail slept soundly for the first time in weeks, without the restless turning that usually followed a day of schoolyard taunts, Ruby sat by the window mending a shirt for Mr. Henderson at the bank, and found her thoughts straying again and again to a pair of storm-gray eyes and hands gentle enough to hold a frightened child securely in a saddle. 3 days later, Ruby was pinning a hem for Mrs. Calloway, the banker's wife, when the bell above her shop door jingled. She looked up to see a young woman with honey-blonde hair and Zachariah's same storm-gray eyes standing uncertainly in the doorway. "Mrs. Morley?" the woman asked. "I'm Hannah Powell. My brother Zach suggested I might come see you about a wedding dress." And so it began, with a wedding dress commission that brought not just Hannah, but a steady stream of Powell ranch hands and their wives to Ruby's door. Whether by Hannah's recommendation or Zachariah's influence, Ruby couldn't be sure, but within weeks, she had more work than she could manage alone. She hired Mabel, the blacksmith's widow, to help with the simpler mending, freeing Ruby to focus on the more intricate dressmaking that brought in better pay. Abigail, too, noticed the change. The taunts at school didn't disappear entirely, but they diminished as the Powell name became associated with the Morleys. The day Zachariah rode into town specifically to deliver a bolt of fine silk for Hannah's dress, stopping conspicuously in front of the school during recess to ask Abigail her opinion on the color, was the day the "No Kin Abby" chant died for good. Ruby told herself it was gratitude she felt when Zachariah appeared at their door with game from his hunting trips or fresh vegetables from the ranch's kitchen garden. She insisted to herself that the flutter in her stomach when he lingered to talk was nothing more than appreciation for his kindness to Abigail. And if she took extra care with her appearance on the days she knew he might stop by, well, that was just common courtesy. But then came the night of the spring social, a tradition in Timber Creek to celebrate the end of winter's isolation. Ruby had declined attending until Hannah personally delivered the invitation and insisted that Ruby and Abigail must come as her guests. Ruby made a new dress for Abigail out of calico she'd been saving and altered one of her own better dresses from St. Louis, adding fresh trim to make it suitable for the occasion. "You look like a princess, Mama," Abigail breathed when Ruby emerged from behind the dressing screen in the pale blue gown with its ivory lace collar. Ruby smiled, smoothing the fabric over her hips. "Hardly that, but thank you, sweet pea." They walked to the town hall together, Abigail skipping ahead in her excitement. The building was strung with lanterns, and the sound of fiddle music spilled out into the spring evening. Ruby hesitated at the entrance, suddenly uncertain, but Abigail tugged her forward. Inside, the hall was transformed. Tables laden with food lined the walls, and couples already moved across the open floor in time to the music. Ruby scanned the crowd, looking for Hannah, but it was Zachariah who found them first. "Mrs. Morley," he said, appearing at her elbow. "Miss Abigail." He wore a clean white shirt with a string tie, his usual worn chaps replaced by dark trousers, but his boots were still dusty from the trail, and his hair still curled damply from what must have been a hasty washing. "Mr. Powell," Ruby acknowledged, hoping the heat she felt rising in her cheeks wasn't visible in the lantern light. "Zach." Abigail greeted him with the enthusiasm of a child who had, over the past weeks, come to look forward to his visits almost as much as Ruby herself did. He crouched down to Abigail's level. "Don't you look pretty as a picture, Miss Abigail? That's a mighty fine dress you're wearing." "Mama made it," Abigail said proudly. "She's the best seamstress in the whole territory. That's what Mrs. Calloway says." "I believe it," Zachariah said, rising to his full height again and allowing his gaze to travel over Ruby's dress in a way that made her breath catch. "Your mama has talented hands indeed." Before Ruby could respond, Hannah appeared, radiant in her engagement glow, and swept Abigail away to meet her fiancé and sample the dessert table. Left alone with Zachariah, Ruby found herself suddenly tongue-tied. "Would you care to dance, Ruby?" he asked, offering his hand. She hesitated only a moment before placing her fingers in his. "I'm afraid I'm out of practice. It's been some time since I attended any social functions." "The steps come back quick enough," he assured her, leading her to the dance floor where several couples were moving through a lively reel. "And I promise not to tread on your toes too badly." To Ruby's surprise, Zachariah was a graceful dancer, guiding her through the steps with the same confidence he showed in the saddle. As they moved together, she gradually relaxed, allowing herself to enjoy the warmth of his hand at her waist, the gleam in his eyes when he looked down at her. "You've been a godsend to this town," he said as they turned. "Half the women here are wearing your handiwork tonight." Ruby shook her head. "I'm just making a living same as anyone." "You're doing more than that." His voice lowered. "You're raising that girl of yours with more spine than most men I know. Coming out here alone, starting over, takes courage." "Or desperation," Ruby countered. His hand tightened slightly on hers. "Sometimes they look the same from the outside." The music shifted to a slower waltz, and Zachariah drew her a fraction closer, still maintaining a respectable distance, but close enough that Ruby could detect the clean scent of soap and leather that clung to him. "The boys at school have stopped teasing Abigail," she said, needing to acknowledge what he'd done for them. "I know that's your doing," he shrugged. "Just needed a reminder of their manners is all." "It's more than that," Ruby insisted. "You've given her something I couldn't, no matter how hard I tried." "And what's that?" "A place to belong." Ruby's voice caught. "Someone to stand up for her." Zachariah's eyes darkened. "Every child deserves that, and every woman too." The intensity in his gaze made Ruby look away. "We manage well enough on our own." "Never said you didn't." He guided her through a turn. "But even the strongest stallion runs with the herd when he can. There's no shame in leaning on others now and then." Ruby thought of all the ways Zachariah had insinuated himself into their lives over the past weeks: the game he brought, the vegetables, the books he lent to Abigail, who was developing a voracious appetite for reading, the business he directed Ruby's way. She'd been so determined to stand on her own that she'd nearly missed the hand extended in genuine friendship. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything you've done for us." "Hasn't been entirely selfless," he admitted, a smile tugging at one corner of his mouth. "I've grown fond of seeing you and Abigail. Brightens my day, truth be told." Before Ruby could formulate a response to this unexpected confession, a commotion near the refreshment table caught their attention. Abigail stood rigid, punch dripping from the front of her new dress, while Billy Calloway, the banker's 10-year-old son, stood with an empty cup in his hand and a smirk on his face. "Oops," the boy said loudly enough to be heard across the room. "Guess no kin Abby can't even hold a cup right." The music faltered as all eyes turned to the scene. Ruby immediately started toward her daughter, but Zachariah's hand on her arm stopped her. "Wait," he said softly. "Let's see what she does." Ruby wanted to protest, to rush to her child's aid, but something in Zachariah's steady gaze held her back. She watched as Abigail took a deep breath, her small shoulders squaring just the way Ruby had taught her. "It's all right, Billy," Abigail said in a clear voice that carried in the sudden silence. "Accidents happen, and my name is Abigail, not Abby. Only my friends call me Abby." A murmur of approval rippled through the adults watching. Mrs. Calloway, red-faced with embarrassment, hurried over to scold her son and apologize profusely to Abigail. But it was Hannah who truly saved the moment, appearing at Abigail's side with a damp cloth and a conspiratorial smile. "You know," Hannah said loudly enough for those nearby to hear, "when I was about your age, I spilled an entire bowl of punch down the front of my Sunday dress. My brother Zach teased me for weeks." She dabbed at Abigail's dress. "But between you and me, I think your mama can work magic with fabric. I bet she'll have this good as new in no time." Abigail's chin lifted. "Mama can fix anything." Ruby felt tears prick her eyes at her daughter's unwavering faith. "See that?" Zachariah said quietly beside her. "That's all you, Ruby. You've given her something far more valuable than any name or connection. You've given her dignity." The music resumed, and the moment passed, but something had shifted. Ruby saw it in the way Mrs. Henderson came to ask her about making summer dresses for her daughters. She felt it in the invitations from other mothers for Abigail to join their children for play. And most of all, she recognized it in herself, a willingness to accept the community that was gradually opening to embrace them. Later, as Ruby and Abigail walked home under a canopy of stars, Abigail skipping ahead despite her stained dress, Ruby found herself thinking about belonging, about how places became home not just through time and familiarity, but through the connections forged with people who came to matter. And one person in particular, she admitted to herself, was beginning to matter very much indeed. The weeks following the spring social brought changes to Timber Creek. The winter's snowmelt had swollen the creek that gave the town its name, and a late April storm had washed out part of the trail connecting the town to the railroad 20 miles south. The isolation wasn't unusual for the season, but it meant supplies ran low at the general store, and mail delivery was sporadic at best. For Ruby, the disruption brought unexpected opportunity. With new fabrics delayed, women brought old garments for alteration and mending, keeping her busier than ever. She and Mabel worked long hours, their fingers flying over cloth as they transformed outdated dresses and worn shirts into fresh garments that would see their owners through, until the supply wagons could make it through again. Zachariah's visits became more regular during this time, ostensibly to check on how she and Abigail were faring with the shortages, but Ruby suspected other reasons kept bringing him to her door. Sometimes he brought freshly caught trout or venison, other times books for Abigail or news from the outlying ranches. Always, he lingered to talk, sitting at her small kitchen table while she worked, telling stories of the cattle drive he was preparing for or listening as she spoke of her life before Timber Creek. On one such evening in early May, with Abigail already asleep in the curtained-off section of the cabin that served as her bedroom, Zachariah watched Ruby's hands as she embroidered delicate flowers along the cuff of a blouse. "My mother used to sew like that," he said, his voice soft in the lamplight. "She'd sit by the fire at night making shirts for my father and patching our trousers. Hannah got her skill with a needle, but not me. I can stitch up a saddle bag or a torn bridle in a pinch, but nothing fine like what you do." Ruby glanced up, surprised by the personal revelation. Zachariah rarely spoke of his family beyond Hannah. "Is your mother still living?" He shook his head. "Lost her and my father both to the fever that swept through 5 years back. Hannah was just 17. I was 22 and working as a hand on what's now our ranch. The owner, Old Man Daniels, had no children of his own. When he passed 2 years later, he left the place to me. Said I'd earned it with my sweat and blood. He rubbed a thumb over a scar that crossed his palm. He wasn't wrong about the blood part. I'm sorry about your parents, Ruby said, setting her work aside. It's hard losing family. It was harder on Hannah. She'd been planning to go east to school, had dreams of becoming a teacher. Instead, she stayed to help me get the ranch on its feet. A smile softened his features. But she'll have her own family now with Thomas, and he's a good man. We'll make her happy. And what about you? Ruby asked, the question slipping out before she could reconsider. Have you never thought of having a family of your own? Zachariah's eyes met hers across the table, and the intensity in them made her breath catch. I've thought about it, more lately than ever before. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken possibilities. Ruby looked down at her hands, suddenly uncertain. Ruby, Zachariah began, then paused as if gathering his courage. I didn't come here tonight just to bring you those rabbits. I suspected as much, she admitted. You've been bringing game regularly, and while I appreciate it, my neighbors must think I'm feeding an army. He chuckled, the tension easing slightly. I've been meaning to ask you something. Been working up to it for weeks now, truth be told. Ruby's heart quickened. Ask me what? The cattle drive to Denver starts next week. I'll be gone most of a month, maybe longer if the weather doesn't cooperate. He leaned forward, his forearms resting on the table. Before I go, I'd like your permission to call on you, properly I mean, not just these friendly visits. Ruby stared at him, stunned by the formal request. Call on me. Zachariah, I'm a widow with a child, scraping by on mending and dressmaking. You own the largest ranch in the county. Surely you could set your sights higher. Anger flashed briefly in his eyes. Is that what you think I'm doing? Setting my sights, like you're some prize buck I'm hunting. No, Ruby faltered. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? His voice gentled, but his gaze remained direct. Because from where I'm sitting, you're the one who could do better. You're educated, refined. You could have stayed back east, found another husband among your own kind. Instead, you came out here, built something from nothing, raised that girl of yours to stand tall despite everything. If anyone's lowering themselves in this arrangement, it surely isn't me. Ruby shook her head, overwhelmed by his perception of her. You don't understand. My husband, Daniel, he left us with nothing but debts. The boarding house we ran in St. Louis had to be sold to pay his creditors. I came west because I had nowhere else to go, not because I was brave or adventurous. Doesn't matter why you came. It's what you've done since that counts. Zachariah reached across the table, his hand covering hers. I'm not asking for promises, Ruby, just permission to speak my mind and heart when I return from the drive. To see if there might be something worth building between us. Ruby looked at his hand on her, strong, capable, bearing the marks of hard work and a life lived outdoors. So different from Daniel's soft, banker's hands that had never quite managed to hold onto the success he constantly chased. She thought of Abigail's face lighting up whenever Zachariah appeared, of the careful way he listened when the child read to him, his genuine interest in her thoughts and ideas. What about Abigail? She asked softly. Any man in my life would need to understand that she comes first. Always. I'd expect nothing less, he said seriously. Abigail's a fine girl, smart as a whip and twice as sharp. Any man would be proud to call her his daughter. The word daughter hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Ruby withdrew her hand, needing space to think. You're talking about more than courtship, aren't you? Zachariah's gaze didn't waver. I'm talking about possibilities, Ruby. I won't pretend I haven't thought about what it might be like to have you and Abigail at the ranch, to build a life together, but I'm not rushing anything. I respect you too much for that. Ruby stood, moving to the window where she could look out at the night sky, gathering her thoughts. Part of her wanted to say yes immediately, to grasp the security and respectability that Zachariah offered. But another part, the part that had learned the hard way about depending too much on others, held back. "I need time," she said finally, turning to face him. "This is unexpected," he nodded, rising to his feet. "I understand, and I meant what I said, no promises needed now. Just know that when I return from the drive, I'll be calling on you properly, taking you and Abigail for Sunday drives, bringing you to dinner at the ranch so you can see the place for yourself." A smile tugged at his lips. "Courting you the way a woman like you deserves to be courted." Ruby couldn't help but smile in return. "And if the lady in question isn't interested in being courted, then I'll tip my hat and ride away with no hard feelings." His expression grew serious again, "but I'm hoping it won't come to that." He crossed to where she stood, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand to her face, his thumb brushing lightly across her cheek. "Think on it while I'm gone," he said softly. "That's all I ask." Then he was stepping back, reaching for his hat on the peg by the door. "I'll stop by before we head out. Make sure you and Abigail have everything you need while I'm away." And then he was gone, the door closing quietly behind him, leaving Ruby standing in the middle of her small cabin with her heart racing, and her mind full of possibilities she'd long since stopped allowing herself to consider. The morning Zachariah and his men were to leave for the cattle drive dawned clear and cool. Ruby had risen earlier than usual, putting extra care into her appearance, despite telling herself it didn't matter. Abigail, too, seemed to sense the importance of the day, wearing her best pinafore over her school dress without being asked. They were just finishing breakfast when hoofbeats outside announced Zachariah's arrival. Abigail rushed to the door, flinging it open before Ruby could caution her about proper decorum. "Zach," she called, "we thought you might have left already." Zachariah dismounted, dressed for the trail in worn chaps and a sturdy jacket, his saddlebags packed and a bedroll secured behind his saddle. "And miss saying goodbye to my favorite ladies in Timber Creek." "Not a chance, Miss Abigail." He produced 2 small packages from his saddlebag, handing the larger one to Abigail. "A little something for while I'm gone, so you don't forget me entirely." Abigail tore into the paper eagerly, gasping with delight when she revealed a carved wooden horse, its details remarkably lifelike despite the simple material. "Did you make this?" Zachariah nodded, a hint of shyness in his smile. "Nights on the trail get long, whittling passes the time." "It looks just like your mare," Abigail exclaimed, examining the carving from all angles. "I'll keep it right by my bed." "Thank you, Zach." Ruby watched the exchange with a lump in her throat. No one had given Abigail a gift just because, not since Daniel died. Certainly no one had crafted something with their own hands specifically for her. "And this is for you," Zachariah said, turning to Ruby and offering the smaller package, "though it's nowhere near as fine as what you could make yourself." Ruby unwrapped the gift carefully, revealing a handkerchief of fine linen, the edges carefully hemmed if not perfectly even, with the initials RM embroidered in one corner in simple but neat stitches. "Hannah helped with the lettering," he admitted, "but the rest I did myself." "Probably not up to your standards, but it's beautiful," Ruby interrupted, genuinely touched by the effort he'd put into creating something for her. "I'll treasure it." Their eyes met over the handkerchief, and in that moment Ruby knew her decision was already made. The thought of Zachariah not returning, of losing this chance at happiness, was suddenly unbearable. "Zachariah," she began, but he shook his head. "When I get back," he said firmly. "We'll talk then, I want you to be sure." He knelt to accept Abigail's exuberant hug, then straightened and turned to Ruby. For a moment, she thought he might embrace her as well, but he simply took her hand, pressing it briefly between both of his. "Take care of each other while I'm gone," he said, his eyes conveying far more than his words. Then he mounted his horse, tipped his hat to them both, and rode away toward the ranch where the rest of the drive crew would be waiting. Ruby and Abigail stood on the porch, watching until he disappeared from view. Abigail clutched her wooden horse, and Ruby held the handkerchief, both of them already counting the days until his return. The next 4 weeks passed with agonizing slowness. Ruby threw herself into her work, accepting every commission that came her way, expanding her business to include not just women's clothing but men's shirts, and even simple upholstery for the hotel that was being renovated on the north end of town. Abigail flourished as spring deepened into early summer. Her status at school continued to improve, with several girls now counting her as a friend. Ruby credited this partly to Zachariah's influence, but recognized that Abigail's own resilience had finally begun to win over her peers. Letters arrived from Zachariah twice during his absence, brief, practical communications that nonetheless revealed his growing feelings in the care he took to inquire after their well-being and share small details of the trail that he thought might interest them. Ruby read them aloud to Abigail, who insisted on keeping them in a special box alongside her wooden horse. It was Hannah who brought news of the drive's success and the crew's impending return. She arrived at Ruby's shop one afternoon in early June, her wedding preparations now in full swing. "They've reached Denver and sold the herd for a good price," she announced, settling into the chair by Ruby's work table. "Zach sent word they should be home within the week, barring any trouble on the return journey." Ruby tried to hide the flutter of excitement this news triggered, but Hannah's knowing smile suggested she wasn't entirely successful. "He talks about you in his letters to me, you know," Hannah said casually, examining a bolt of silk Ruby had ordered for her wedding dress. "More than he probably realizes." Ruby concentrated on the stitches she was placing in Mrs. Miller's summer dress. "We've become friends. He's been very kind to Abigail." Hannah's laugh was gentle but knowing. "Ruby Morley. My brother has never in his life carved a wooden anything for any friend, nor has he spent 3 evenings practicing embroidery stitches until his fingers were raw just to put someone's initials on a handkerchief." Heat crept into Ruby's cheeks. "He mentioned he had help with the lettering." "Oh, I helped, all right, mostly by stopping him from throwing the whole project into the fire when he pricked himself for the 20th time." Hannah leaned forward. "He's smitten with you, Ruby, both of you. And unless I'm very much mistaken, the feeling is mutual." Ruby set her sewing aside, meeting Hannah's gaze directly. "Your brother is a good man, Hannah, better than I dared hope to find, especially out here, but there's so much to consider. Abigail's future, the difference in our situations." "Do you love him?" Hannah asked simply. The directness of the question took Ruby aback. Did she love Zachariah Powell? She thought of his quiet strength, his unwavering support, the gentleness with which he treated Abigail, the respect with which he always addressed Ruby herself. She thought of how empty the past weeks had felt without his regular visits, how often she found herself looking toward the door, hoping to see his tall frame filling it. "I think I could," she admitted softly. "Very easily." Hannah nodded, satisfied. "Then the rest is just details." "Zach has never been one to care about what others think is proper or fitting. He knows his own mind." She reached across the table to squeeze Ruby's hand. "Just be honest with him when he returns. That's all he'll ask of you." The day of Zachariah's return dawned hot and clear. Ruby had just opened her shop when she heard the commotion on the main street, horses and men returning, dust rising in the morning sun as the drive crew made their way into town. She moved to the window, scanning the riders for Zachariah's familiar figure. She spotted him near the rear of the group, his hat pulled low against the sun, his shoulders straight despite what must have been weeks of hard riding. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up, his eyes finding her window with unerring accuracy. Even from a distance, she could see his face transform with a smile that sent her heart racing. He raised a hand in greeting, and she returned the gesture, suddenly shy despite the weeks of anticipation. He nodded once, then continued with the crew toward the saloon where the men would traditionally celebrate their successful drive before dispersing to their homes and families. Ruby returned to her work, knowing it might be hours before Zachariah made his way to her door. But just as she was considering closing for lunch, a shadow fell across her threshold, and she looked up to find him standing there, hat in hand, his face clean-shaven and his trail clothes exchanged for a fresh shirt and trousers. "You're back," she said, the inadequacy of the words striking her even as she spoke them. "I am," he confirmed, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "Rode straight to the ranch, cleaned up, and came right back to town. Didn't even stop for a celebratory drink with the boys." Ruby set aside the shirt she was mending, wiping her palms nervously on her apron. "Abigail will be disappointed to have missed you. She's at school until 3. I know." He moved closer, his eyes never leaving her face. "I wanted to see you first, alone." The directness of his gaze made her breath catch. "Zachariah, Zach," he corrected gently. "I think we're well past formalities, don't you?" Despite her nervousness, Ruby smiled. "Zach, then." He closed the remaining distance between them, taking her hands in his. "I've had a lot of time to think out on the trail, Ruby, about what I want, what I'm offering, what I hope you might consider." Ruby looked up at him, at the earnestness in his expression, and all her carefully prepared responses fled. "I missed you," she said simply. "More than I expected to." His hands tightened on hers. "Is that a good sign?" "I think so." She drew a steadying breath. "Zach, before you say anything else, there's something you need to understand. Abigail and we're a package. Anyone in my life has to." "I know," he interrupted gently. "And I wouldn't want it any other way. Ruby, I'm not just asking to court you. I'm asking for a chance to be a father to Abigail as well, to give her my name, my protection, my support." Ruby's eyes widened. "You're talking about marriage?" "Yes." No hesitation, no uncertainty in his voice. "Not today or tomorrow. I want to court you properly first, give you time to be sure. But yes, marriage is what I'm hoping for eventually." Ruby withdrew her hands, needing space to think clearly. "It's a lot to consider." "I know that too." He didn't try to reclaim her hands, respecting her need for distance. "And I'll give you all the time you need, but I wanted my intentions to be clear from the start." The bell above the door jingled, and they both turned to see Sheriff Miller stepping inside, his expression apologetic when he realized he was interrupting. "Sorry, Mrs. Morley." "Powell." He nodded to them both. "Just wanted to drop off these trousers for mending when you have time. No rush." Ruby took the garment, grateful for the moment to compose herself. "I should have them ready by Friday, Sheriff." With another nod and a knowing glance between them, the sheriff departed, leaving them alone once more. Zachariah reached for his hat. "I should go. Let you get back to work. Would it be all right if I stopped by this evening? To see Abigail and maybe discuss this further?" Ruby nodded, finding her voice. "We'd like that. Dinner is at 6 if you'd care to join us." The smile that lit his face was answer enough. "I'll be there." He hesitated, then stepped forward and before Ruby could react, pressed a gentle kiss to her cheek. "Until tonight, then." He was gone before she could respond, leaving her standing in the middle of her shop with her hand pressed to her cheek and her heart beating a wild rhythm against her ribs. That evening, Zachariah arrived promptly at 6, a bouquet of wildflowers for Ruby and a new book for Abigail tucked under his arm. Abigail's squeal of delight when she opened the door was enough to bring smiles to both adults' faces. "You're back," she exclaimed, throwing her arms around his waist in an enthusiastic hug. "Did you see lots of mountains? Were there Indians? Did you have to sleep on the ground every night?" Zachariah laughed, lifting her easily and spinning her once before setting her back on her feet. "Yes to all three, Miss Abigail. And I have stories that will curl your hair, but first, let me say a proper hello to your mama." He turned to Ruby, who stood watching them from the kitchen doorway, and the warmth in his eyes made her previous hesitation seem distant and unimportant. "These are for you," he said, offering the wildflowers. "Not as fine as what you'd find in a city shop, but the hills were full of them on the ride back." Ruby accepted the bouquet, burying her nose in the colorful blossoms to hide her blush. "They're lovely, thank you." The evening passed in comfortable conversation, with Zachariah regaling them with tales of the cattle drive, the difficult river crossings, the nights spent watching the stars wheel overhead, the satisfaction of delivering the herd safely and securing a good price for the ranch. After dinner, when Abigail was engrossed in her new book by the fireplace, Zachariah helped Ruby with the dishes, their hands occasionally brushing in the wash basin, each contact sending a shiver of awareness through her. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier," Ruby said quietly, mindful of Abigail nearby, "about your intentions." Zachariah stilled, a plate half dried in his hands. "And, I think, I would like to be courted, Zach Powell." She glanced up at him, her heart in her eyes. "I can't promise where it will lead, but I want to find out." The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "That's all I'm asking for, Ruby. A chance to show you what we could be together." From that evening forward, Zachariah became a regular fixture in their lives. He took Ruby and Abigail on Sunday drives in his wagon, showing them the beauty of the territory beyond the town limits. He brought them to the Powell Ranch, where Abigail fell in love with the horses and Ruby found herself imagining a life there, with its spacious rooms and well-tended gardens. Hannah's wedding in late June provided an opportunity for the entire town to see them together as a couple. As Zachariah escorted Ruby and Abigail to the ceremony, the speculative glances and whispered comments that had once been critical were now approving. The seamstress and her fatherless child had been elevated by their association with the Powell name, but Ruby found she cared less about that than she once might have. What mattered was the genuine affection growing between them, the sense of rightness she felt when Zachariah's hand rested at the small of her back, or when he listened intently to Abigail's endless questions. The 4th of July celebration brought another milestone. The town gathered for a picnic and fireworks display, families spreading blankets on the grass near the creek. As dusk fell and the first rockets illuminated the sky, Zachariah drew Ruby slightly away from the crowd, into the shadow of a large cottonwood tree. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. "Something I've been saving for the right moment." He withdrew a small velvet pouch, opening it to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a modest but clear diamond. "This was my mother's," he explained. "She told me before she died to save it for the woman who captured my heart completely." Ruby's breath caught. "Zach, I'm not asking for your answer tonight," he said quickly. "I know it's soon, but I wanted you to have this, to know that my intentions are serious and my feelings are true." He took her hand in his. "I love you, Ruby Morley, you and Abigail both, And whenever you're ready, a month from now or a year from now, I'll be waiting to make you my wife." Tears welled in Ruby's eyes. "You truly want us both, not just me, but Abigail too." "Ruby," he said solemnly, "I fell in love with Abigail first. That day in the rain, when she sat so brave and proud in my saddle despite everything she'd been through, that's when I knew I wanted to be part of your lives. Loving you came after, though just as surely." Ruby looked down at the ring nestled in his palm, then back up at his face, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. "Ask me," she whispered, his brow furrowed. "You're sure? I don't want to rush you." "Ask me, Zach," she repeated, more firmly this time. Understanding dawned in his expression. Slowly, deliberately, he knelt before her, still holding her hand in his. "Ruby Morley, will you do me the great honor of becoming my wife? Will you let me love and cherish you and Abigail for all the days of our lives?" Ruby's answer was lost in the boom of fireworks overhead, but the joy on her face as she nodded and extended her finger for the ring told Zachariah everything he needed to know. He slipped the ring into place, then rose to his feet, gathering her into his arms and kissing her properly for the first time, heedless of any watching eyes. When they finally broke apart, breathless and smiling, Ruby rested her forehead against his chest. "We should tell Abigail first, before anyone else." They found the child still watching the fireworks display, her face upturned in wonder at the bursts of color against the night sky. When Ruby called her name, she turned, her expression curious as she took in their linked hands and flushed faces. "Abigail," Ruby began, kneeling to her daughter's level. "Mr. Powell, Zach has asked me a very important question. He's asked if I would marry him if we would become a family together." Abigail's eyes widened. "What did you say?" "I said yes," Ruby replied, unable to keep the smile from her face. "But it's important to me, to both of us, that you're happy about this too. How would you feel about Zach becoming part of our family, about him being a father to you?" For a long moment, Abigail was silent, her young face solemn as she considered the question. Then she looked up at Zachariah, who had knelt beside Ruby in the grass. "Would I live at your ranch?" she asked practically. "With the horses," Zachariah nodded. "You would. And you'd have your own room with a view of the mountains." "Would I still go to school in town?" "Of course," Ruby assured her. "Nothing would change about your education." Abigail thought for another moment, then asked the question that mattered most to her. "Would people still call me no kin Abby?" Zachariah's expression grew serious. "No, they would not. Because you would be Abigail Powell. You would have my name just like your mama. You would belong to our family and everyone would know it." A slow smile spread across Abigail's face, starting small but growing until it lit her entire countenance. Without warning, she launched herself into Zachariah's arms, nearly knocking him backward onto the grass. "Yes," she exclaimed. "Yes, I want you to be my papa." Ruby watched through tear-blurred eyes as Zachariah held Abigail close, his own eyes suspiciously bright in the glow of the fireworks. Over Abigail's head, he reached for Ruby's hand, drawing her into their embrace until they were a circle of three, a family newly formed under the explosions of light and color that seemed to celebrate their joy. News of their engagement spread quickly through Timber Creek. Some expressed surprise at the speed of the courtship, but most who had observed Zachariah's attentions over the previous months merely nodded with satisfaction. Hannah was ecstatic, immediately offering to help with wedding preparations and insisting that Ruby use the finest materials for her dress. "Nothing but the best for my new sister," she declared, accompanying Ruby to select fabrics when the next supply wagon arrived from the railroad. They set the wedding date for early September, when the summer heat would have broken, but before the first snows threatened the mountain passes. This gave Ruby time to finish her outstanding commissions and make arrangements to move her business to the ranch, where Zachariah was already preparing a sunny room to serve as her new sewing studio. As the weeks passed, Ruby found herself embracing the future with a confidence she hadn't felt since before Daniel's death. Zachariah's steady presence in their lives, his unwavering support and affection, healed wounds she hadn't realized were still raw. And the transformation in Abigail was nothing short of miraculous. The child blossomed under Zachariah's attention, gaining confidence not just in school but in all aspects of her life. The day Zachariah formally adopted Abigail, a week before the wedding, marked another milestone. They traveled to the county seat, where a judge made official what they already felt in their hearts, that Abigail was a Powell in every way that mattered. On the ride back to Timber Creek, Abigail clutched the adoption papers to her chest, a smile of profound contentment on her face. "No one can ever say I don't have kin again," she said softly. "I have a papa now." Zachariah reached across the wagon seat to squeeze her shoulder, his own expression one of fierce pride. "You always had your mama, Abby. She's worth 10 of any other kin. But yes, now you have me too, for whatever that's worth." "It's worth everything," Ruby said quietly from Abigail's other side. "To both of us." Their wedding day dawned clear and perfect, the September sky a deep, cloudless blue above the mountains that ringed the valley. Ruby stood in Hannah's bedroom at the ranch, where she had spent the night according to tradition, while Zachariah stayed in town with his foreman to observe the superstition about not seeing the bride before the ceremony. "You look beautiful," Hannah said, securing the last pearl button on Ruby's gown, a creation of ivory silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, the most elaborate garment Ruby had ever made for herself. "Zach won't know what hit him." Ruby smoothed her hands over the skirt, hardly recognizing the woman in the mirror as herself. Gone was the tired widow in practical calico. In her place stood a bride in silk and lace, her cheeks flushed with happiness, her eyes bright with anticipation. "I never thought I'd have this again," she confessed to Hannah. "After Daniel died, I was so focused on survival, on making a life for Abigail, that I couldn't see beyond the next day, the next meal, the next payment due." Hannah squeezed her hand. "And now I see a future," Ruby said simply. "One filled with love and security and possibility, not just for Abigail, but for me too." A knock at the door announced Abigail's arrival, dressed in a pale blue frock that Ruby had made to complement her own gown. The child's hair had been carefully arranged by Hannah, with white ribbons woven through the dark curls. "Mama, you look like an angel," Abigail exclaimed, her eyes wide with wonder. "Wait until Papa sees you." The easy way Abigail had taken to calling Zachariah Papa still brought tears to Ruby's eyes. It fit so naturally, as if he had always been part of their lives, always been the father Abigail deserved. The ceremony itself was held in the ranch's large front yard, where Zachariah had ordered a white wooden arch erected and decorated with late summer flowers. The entire town seemed to have turned out, filling the rows of chairs that faced the arch. Even Mrs. Calloway was there, her son Billy notably better behaved than he had been at the spring social. As Ruby walked toward the arch on the arm of Sheriff Miller, who had offered to give her away, she saw only Zachariah waiting for her, his expression one of such naked adoration that her heart seemed to stumble in her chest. Beside him stood Abigail, who would be part of the ceremony in recognition of the family they were creating together. The vows were traditional but heartfelt, spoken in clear voices that carried across the hushed gathering. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Zachariah didn't immediately kiss Ruby as was customary. Instead, he knelt before Abigail, taking her small hands in his. "Abigail Powell," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I promise to be the father you deserve. To protect you, guide you, support you in all your dreams, and love you as my own flesh and blood all the days of my life." Abigail's response wasn't part of any script, but it was perfect nonetheless. "I promise to be the best daughter ever," she said solemnly, "and to help take care of the horses." Laughter rippled through the guests, breaking the tension of the moment. Zachariah rose, lifting Abigail into his arms, then turned to Ruby with such joy on his face that she felt it echo in her own heart. Only then did he claim his bride's kiss, with Abigail between them, completing the circle of their family. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, with music and dancing and more food than even the substantial crowd could consume. As darkness fell, lanterns were lit, casting a golden glow over the yard where couples still danced and children played games of tag between the tables. Ruby found a moment of quiet on the porch, watching the festivities from a slight distance, trying to absorb the reality that this was now her home, these people her community, this happiness her life. Zachariah found her there, slipping an arm around her waist and pressing a kiss to her temple. "Getting tired, Mrs. Powell," the name still sent a thrill through her. "Just taking it all in, it's rather overwhelming." He followed her gaze to where Abigail was teaching some of the younger children a clapping game, her face animated and confident in a way that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. "She's something special, our girl," Zachariah said softly. "Our girl," Ruby repeated, leaning into his embrace. "I like the sound of that. You know," he said thoughtfully, "there's room for more if you're willing. This house was built for a large family." Ruby turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw with gentle fingers. "I'd like that. Brothers and sisters for Abigail, children with your eyes and maybe my stubbornness. God help us if they have my stubbornness and your determination," he chuckled, capturing her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "We'll have the most strong-willed brood in the territory." "And the most loved," Ruby added softly. Zachariah's expression grew serious. "That's a promise, Ruby Powell, one I intend to keep every day for the rest of our lives." As he lowered his mouth to hers in a kiss that held both tenderness and passion, Ruby felt the last of her old fears dissolve. The path that had led her to Timber Creek had been paved with hardship and uncertainty, but it had brought her here, to this man, this love, this family they were building together. And as the music swelled from the yard and the stars emerged in the velvet sky above, Ruby knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, in the arms of a man who had looked at a widow and her fatherless child and seen not their lack, but their worth, who had taken a little girl mocked for having no kin into his saddle with pride, and in doing so, had claimed them both as his own. Epilogue: 5 years later, Ruby stood on the porch of the Powell ranch house, watching as Zachariah taught their 3-year-old son, Daniel, to sit astride a gentle pony. Beside them, Abigail, now 11 and growing into a beauty that turned heads in town, offered encouragement to her little brother while keeping a watchful eye on her 1-year-old sister, Grace, who toddled around the yard under her supervision. The ranch had prospered under Zachariah's management, expanding its operations to include not just cattle but horses as well, quality stock that commanded premium prices at markets as far away as Denver and San Francisco. Ruby's dressmaking business had evolved too, with a small staff of women who worked in the bright sewing room at the ranch, creating garments that were shipped to shops in larger towns throughout the territory. But it was their family that gave Ruby the most pride. Abigail had blossomed into a confident, kind-hearted girl who excelled at school, and had a natural way with both animals and people. She had Zachariah wrapped around her finger, and he made no secret of his pride in the daughter who, though not of his blood, was every bit his child in the ways that mattered. Little Daniel had his father's storm-gray eyes and his mother's determined chin, a combination that promised both strength and sensitivity as he grew. And baby Grace, with her father's blonde curls and her mother's delicate features, was already showing signs of the beauty she would one day become. As Ruby watched, Zachariah lifted Daniel from the pony and set him on the ground, ruffling his hair with affectionate pride. He glanced up, catching Ruby's eye across the yard, and the love in his gaze still had the power to take her breath away. He crossed to the porch, taking the steps 2 at a time to reach her side. Thinking deep thoughts, Mrs. Powell, Ruby smiled, leaning into his embrace. Just counting my blessings. They're too numerous to keep track of these days. Zachariah followed her gaze to their children, his expression softening. Remember that first day in town, when I put Abigail up in my saddle? How could I forget? It changed everything for us. For me too, he admitted. I didn't know it then, but that was the day I started falling in love with both of you. Ruby turned in his arms, rising on tiptoe to press a kiss to his lips. Thank you for seeing us, Zach. For looking past what everyone else saw, a widow with no connections, a child with no kin, and seeing something worth fighting for. His arms tightened around her. Best fight I ever won. He glanced at their children again, then back to Ruby, his eyes full of all they'd built together. And I'd do it all again in a heartbeat. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long golden shadows across the yard where their children played, Ruby rested her head against her husband's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. From mocked and marginalized to cherished and central, that was the journey Zachariah had made possible for both her and Abigail. And in the laughter of their children, in the strength of the family they'd created together, Ruby heard the sweetest sound of all, the sound of belonging, of having not just kin, but a love that had transformed them all.